Firstly, I think we've got a mindset problem in South Africa. We've always been very obedient people, and we've always sort of bowed over to the politicians and to the government. But given where we are now with all the corruption that's come out of the Zondo Commission and elsewhere, we now can see that we're actually being led by a bunch of scumbags who really are only looking after their own interests and couldn't care continental about the rest of the population.
South Africa is in the midst of a 14-year-long energy crisis. How did we get here and how can we get out of it? Well, joining me to discuss is Ted Blom. He is an energy analyst and a one-time Eskom employee. Ted Blom, welcome to the show.
Hi, good afternoon.
So Ted, you have had many decades actually involved in the energy industry. Could you take us back to how it is that you got involved in this space and what has been your experience working in the energy sector in South Africa?
Okay, so I was invited by the headhunters to join Eskom in about 88, and they were looking to bring in streetwise so-called people at that time, because what's happened with Eskom today and historically is that people join Eskom after school or get a bursary and they stay there for the rest of their lives. So there's very little integration from outside of Eskom in terms of know-how and development and so on. And so I was brought in on that ticket. And within a couple of weeks, I managed to rise to the top of that little population center in Eskom, and became the manager of management and financial consulting within Eskom. I led a team of 17 postgrads, firefighting all the problem areas within Eskom. And you'll understand that Eskom is a big organization, certainly has more than 400 sites around the country, and it's quite a complex engineering business in as far as all the components need to be in sync for it to operate efficiently. Energy creation or generation is not new, it's 100 years old, but the components have changed quite drastically over the last 100 years. Yeah.
Right. So Ted, take us through how we got to this point in terms of the breakdown in our energy system in South Africa, because energy is really the foundation of economic activity. This is putting a hard ceiling on South Africa's growth. How did we get into this mess?
Okay, absolutely. So I think what you're trying to point at is energy security. And if you haven't got energy security, you might as well not have energy. It's actually more disruptive than having no energy at all. Yes, I was at Eskom at my third consulting assignment at Eskom from 2006 to 2008. And I just by fortune happened to look at the pantry, Eskom's pantry of coal on the 15th of January 2008. And I saw that the pantry was empty. And I had been in cahoots with the then financial director, Bongani Mkobaba, been trying to root out corruption, which as I started in 2006, I realized that it was no longer the organization that I was proud of and had worked for in the 80s. And it was full of corruption, left, right, and center, especially on the coal side, the coal procurement. And the more we try to put the squeeze on the corruption on the coal procurement side, the more there was a standoff between the corruptors and Eskom. And that eventually led to a sort of a freeze out. We froze out the corruptors at that stage and said, we will not entertain the extension of the emergency mandate, which Eskom implemented in 2001 December for 6 years. We wouldn't extend that because that emergency mandate allowed the procurement department to buy coal willy-nilly from anybody without a tender, without a quote, without a contract, on the back of a cigarette box, without specifications. It was a free-for-all. And I'd uncovered that in 2006 when I got back and I saw it wasn't what I saw previously. And the more we were trying to put the screws on that, the more we were being starved of coal. So on the 15th of January 2008, I looked into the supplies or the storage of coal, and I saw we were down to less than 3 days of coal. And if you know the coal industry, you know that your stockpile floor gets built, and you hopefully never reach it again once you've built it, because that means you're scraping up the bottom of the barrel. And typically what happens over the years is your devolatilized coal, which has no energy value, tends to go down to the bottom. And so you're left at the bottom with rubble and devolatilized coal and ash and maybe some rocks and stuff. So your last 3 days are really precarious in terms of stockpile quality. And that's what we saw. I mean, we thought we still had a few days with the coal left over. And I urged the powers that be at the time to institute emergency overtime and all the other measures to try and rebuild the stockpiles. But as I said, there was a standoff. There was a lot of lies being perpetrated amongst the management at Eskom. And lo and behold, on the Friday, the 18th of January 2008, we had load shedding for the first time in the history of Eskom on a national scale. I mean, they previously had breakdowns, and this is normal, but on a national scale, we headed into 6 months of drastic load shedding. So that was primarily because of the shortage of coal. And not many people understand that. People said, no, well, the equipment was breaking down and it was inadequate. Nonsense. Eskom at that stage had 42 gigawatts of installed capacity, and the maximum demand that we'd experienced up to then was 34 gigawatts. So we still had a good 8 gigawatts of spare capacity. And in terms of worldwide safety margins of 15%, if you add 15% onto 34 gigawatts, it takes you to about 38 gigawatts or so. So you still had more than adequate safety margin in terms of the configuration of the grid. What happened then is Eskom eventually overcame some of the hiccups and got some more coal onto the thing by paying exorbitant prices. Bongani resigned out of frustration with the board, and he couldn't stop the corruption, and I was left vulnerable. So even though Bongani had extended my contract by 10 years, the powers that be immediately saw me as a threat and terminated my my extension of my contract. And so the corruption won the day. And that just kind of carried on, that the emergency mandate was extended for another 7 years. And it's been extended ever since. Every time there's a crisis on the coal side, you can point it down to the extension or non-extension of that emergency mandate, and typically the crooks always win because they hold Eskom to ransom. So what happened? That was the first failure. It was in 2008. Eskom at the time then was busy rushing to try and build new capacity after the government messed up the white paper. They wanted to let the private sector do the power station building, but naively, and this is under Mr. Mbeki, they tried to cap the margins of the private sector. Now, I mean, the private sector doesn't take kindly to interference in their business model. And you can't say, well, you know, we want you to build all this new capacity, but we're going to limit your rate of return to 8%. Typically, the private sector works on a 40% gross margin, and then after tax, they're happy if they get about 15%. And then in lean years, a bit less. But certainly not a gross margin of 8%. Whoever set that hurdle was mad in there and didn't understand the first step of economics. So, yes, so the new power stations weren't built by the private sector. Eskom climbed in, and at that stage, because I was twiddling my thumbs waiting for my contract to end, having uncovered the corruption and having been sterilized by the corruptors inside Eskom, my movement within the building was restricted, and I was had a lot of spare time. Then in 2010, if we can just jump a few years, we had the World Cup, and Eskom was then running tight in terms of the maintenance and availability of their plant, because of the poor quality of the hijacked coal that we were getting, it led to rapid deterioration in the boiler tubes, because the abrasive material of the rocks in the coal caused excessive wear and tear on the boiler tubes. And boiler tubes, typically, I was just reminded the other day, when you build a boiler, you typically don't envisage ever going back into that boiler to fix up the tubes. You design everything to last for 40 years, or in the case of Eskom, 40 years plus another 50% extra, and hopefully those boiler tubes never break. So if you want to go in and repair the boiler tubes, let me tell you, you need to be a midget, because those things are packed so closely together that a guy of my size cannot move in between there and go in and find the broken. And there's thousands of kilometers of tubing, fine tubing inside those boilers to absorb the heat from the fire and turn it into the water into steam. So there's lots of kilometers of this stuff. It's right, it's coiled inside the top of the boiler where it's hot. So you've got to first stop the fire, otherwise you can't get in there, you'll fry. And secondly, you've got to get through the hatch, and then you've got to manipulate your way through all these tubes to try and find the leaks. And often what you have to do is you have to cannibalize the first couple of meters of tubing so that you can get to the actual place where the leaks are and where you're losing pressure. Fix that up, and then you have to replace all the tubing as you exit out of the boiler. You have to replace that. So it becomes a nightmare and a mess, because now you've got 10 million joints where in 40 years you shouldn't have had one joint. And that's all directly related back to the poor quality of the coal that the hijacked people are putting into Eskom, and which Eskom is paying exorbitant prices for. So then in 2010, they were running tight, and the instruction came from the government: keep the lights on. We don't want to have a fiasco with the soccer. We're expecting 500,000 guests. I think in the end of the day, less than 50,000 people arrived. But Eskom then got used to not doing maintenance. And that maintenance budget, even though it was voted for every year, just dwindled into thin air. I think it got stolen left, right, and center, but the work wasn't done. And then in 2014, suddenly Eskom woke up and said, oh gosh, we haven't done 4 years of maintenance. So that's where the major maintenance blackouts came. And that's where we really had system problems. And that was, in other words, technically related to maintenance issues for the first time in Eskom's history. And that persevered until they had Matona and a couple of other guys trying to run Eskom. They didn't have the experience and the qualifications. And then they got a guy by the name of Brian Molefe, who there's no love lost between Molefe and myself, and the guy by the name of Koko. And as far as I'm concerned, and I've said it time and again, Koko, in terms of engineering expertise, is probably the best product from Eskom. I mean, the fact that he has misdemeanors, he's got to answer for those in his own account at the appropriate forums. But I think people need to be mature and not cloud the one issue with the other. In terms of technical expertise, Koko was the guy who resurrected Eskom, got rid of the load shedding, managed to catch up with the maintenance. In fact, did more maintenance than Eskom had ever done prior to that to try and catch up. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, he left under a cloud because of the Guptas and so on. But if you speak to Koko, he'll tell you he had a gun to his head from Zuma. So he was damned if he did, and he was damned if he didn't. The one gun was from Zuma, the other gun was from Mr. Ramaphosa, and he didn't know what to do. So he closed his eyes and he signed the documents that were put in front of him. Nevertheless, after Koko left, we then saw again a deterioration in the availability of Eskom's plant, and that has exacerbated now to where we are now, where for 3 years in a row, we've had the worst EAF in the 100-year or 99-year history of Eskom. It's now below 60%.
And so, Ted, EAF is energy availability factor. Could you explain that?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the crux. That's to tell you how much of your engine you've got to spare in terms of your throttling capacity. Yes. And typically you'd run your plant at about 75, 80% utilization. But you need your EAF needs to be as good as possible to full capacity, so that you have your safety margin and you have margin to do repairs, etc., etc.
All right. And because of this lack of maintenance, there's been a high degree of unplanned breakdowns, which is stressing the whole grid and which is basically creating a negative, vicious cycle.
It compounds. So the less you have available, the more pressure you put on the stock that is available, and the more you're running it into the ground because you are short of energy. Yeah. And that leads to compounded or excessive breakdowns in its own right.
Okay, so these are the governance and operational problems. Also some pretty significant financial problems. Eskom is very highly indebted. I think they've managed to bring that debt profile down below that.
That's false. That's a gimmick. The 82 billion rand that they paid down is a gimmick. And that's the problem when you put people in that don't come from the energy industry. So the debt should never have ballooned. When they started off with the new build, the debt at Eskom was 40 billion. It was very sustainable, very serviceable, because Eskom typically also had a much cheaper coupon than anybody else in terms of borrowing capacity at a low rate, because they were seen as very low risk. And so if the new power stations had been procured at the tendered value, in other words, 34 billion rand for each for Medupi and Kusile, and 9 billion for Ingula, which then ran to 40 billion. But if they stayed at the tendered amounts and didn't have the corruption, and they stuck with off-the-shelf solutions, which you do when you're in trouble, you don't go and try and be fancy and do fancy footwork when you're in trouble. You stick to what works, a tried and tested recipe. If they'd done those couple of things, they would have been for a way. At the same time, there was a new power station in India, the Mundra power station, built by Tata, built with South African expertise, in fact, the ex-Eskom people. And Mundra came online at 35 billion rand, on time, on budget, and was finished in 2012, and was in fact designed to run on South African coal. So they still had to import the coal from South Africa, and the on-the-grid cost was 48 cents a kilowatt hour. So a fantastic example. I didn't think the Indians were capable of it. I thought we were the leaders, and lo and behold, yeah, we've got egg all over our faces, I suppose, because we still haven't finished those power stations. They won't be finished before 2026 because of overruns and the infrastructure on the water side not being activated in time. In fact, I did that at Eskom in 2007. I said, where's the water for this new power station? They hadn't done anything because all the expertise had been bumped out of Eskom. I arranged with the DWAF, the Department of Water Affairs, got them to put the Medupi program and Kusile program into their water thing. And they said, oh goodness, we have to build Lesotho Highlands phase 2 because there isn't enough water in phase 1. And phase 1 took 14 years, 8 years to build the roads and 6 years to build the dam wall. And I've been up there, those roads are gone. So to build phase 2 will take another couple of years because you have to start by rebuilding the roads. So that's why I'm saying 2026 at least, or even 2028 now, because you need to rebuild a lot of the infrastructure before you can get more water to the power stations.
And of course, there was this major explosion at Medupi. I remember Frans Cronje, our erstwhile CEO at the CRA, the Center for Risk Analysis, he told me that one of his engineering contacts said that they had built the world's largest pipe bomb. And sure enough, a year or so later, the thing exploded. So, I mean, I think that set back that project quite significantly as well.
Yeah, they lost 800 megawatts. Well, not actually 800. The design is 800 megawatts because of design flaws. They struggled and they lied. You know, they lied to the public for 10 years. They said everything's going well, a little bit of overrun here, a little bit of delay here. But they were lying because at the nursery hearings in 2018 in Port Elizabeth, I pulled out the stats. I managed to get hold of the stats. And it showed at the time that Medupi's availability, brand new station, the availability was less than 60%. It's unheard of. Normally, when you build a new station, it runs at close to 100 because you've got to put it through its paces to engage the warranty so that you don't have any comebacks, etc. Kusile at the time was running at under 19% availability. It's shocking. Nobody should have ever signed off on Kusile at that. I mean, it's plainly, clearly a warranty issue. You know, they need to rebuild the thing and fix it up. But people signed off on that. You know, were paid bribes and they signed off on it. So Eskom lied and said it's old, unreliable, decrepit power stations that were letting them down. Meantime, it was the brand new stock that wasn't performing. And I was the first one to throw the spanner in the works with that story. And since then, I consistently found out, other than the Eskom that I worked for, this Eskom has lost its ethics, it's lost its moral compass, and it's become a cesspool of corruption. I only tasted the tip of the mountain in 2006 when I spotted the corruption then. Now that corruption is endemic in every depot, 450 depots, every level of management, and it starts at the megawatt park, unfortunately.
All right. Well, Ted, in a recent interview I had with Russell Lamberti of the business group Sakeliga, we were talking about an article that he had written, a campaign that Sakeliga is looking to run, where he said that energy independence is taken, it's not granted. How do we begin to start to challenge Eskom's monopoly on energy production and distribution in South Africa and start to empower maybe businesses or local communities to start generating their own electricity? I'm sure there's some pretty significant technical challenges to that, but also policy challenges as well. What would you suggest in terms of trying to break Eskom's monopoly?
Okay, so I mean, I don't hold a patent on solutions, but I can offer to share with you my thinking over the last 30 odd years. Firstly, I think we've got a mindset problem in South Africa. You know, we've always been very obedient people, and we've always sort of bowed over to the politicians and to the government. But given where we are now with all the corruption that's come out of the Zondo Commission and elsewhere, we now can see that we're actually being led by a bunch of scumbags who really are only looking after their own interests and couldn't care continental about the rest of the population. So you've got to get your mindset right first and say, listen here, if we're going to wait for these people to sort out our problems, we're going to wait forever. And in fact, the solution will never be dealt. So what we need to say as business people, we have a responsibility to our shareholders and to our communities to take control of what is deficient in our makeup, and to make this economy work, come hell or high water, and irrespective, like in Italy, irrespective of the government of the day. Governments come and governments go, and we are merely custodians of the earth for our future generations. Nobody owns anything. We're just custodians. So if you get the right mindset, then you say, well, what do I need to do? What are the options available to me to address my needs? And again, we started off the conversation off record by saying, whatever the solutions are, they've got to be fit for purpose. And every sector has its own needs and its own profile in terms of what will work in terms of solutions for that sector or for that need. In terms of renewables, I said up front, it's quite good for households, and it's a little bit of an expensive solution because you don't get a lot of efficiency, and it's not that reliable because you need storage capacity one way or the other. But there's very little mission critical stuff happening in your household. So whether you wash your washing today or tomorrow when the sun's out and it can power your washing machine or whatever, it's not critical. Whether you have a cold dinner or a hot dinner, it's not mission critical. But there are mission critical operations in this country, more so because we're an industrialized country with mining, and I cannot, and I have interest in the mining industry. I do mining and energy. I cannot for the moment think of sending people underground when I know there isn't enough electricity to oxygenate them, cool them down, and bring them back safely up on surface if there is an emergency. So that's a mission critical operation, and it's like an operating theater in a hospital. You wouldn't dare start an operation if you think that the power is going to fail within minutes of starting the operation and having cut the patient open. So for those type of operations, you need very reliable, predictable power systems, and you need 24/7 power. Same for your smelters. You can't let your smelter freeze because it will take more than 6 months to unfreeze it and to chip out all the residue. So there are mission critical applications that need predictable, and it's called in the industry dispatchable power. In other words, you can book it ahead of time and say, well, tomorrow morning 6 o'clock when I flick the switch, the power will be there. That's the type of power that you need to run an industrialized economy. And so unfortunately, that type of power typically works best in large chunks, and that's why it's natural for the government to own those type of operations or to initiate those type of operations. And Eskom was initiated mainly by the mining and industry needs of that time in 1923. And the mission given to Dr. Van der Bijl when he set up Eskom was to supply cheap, dispatchable, reliable energy to our industrial engine of South Africa. And it was very, very successful. In fact, Eskom won the award as Global Utility of the Year in 2001 in New York City. And justly so. It was one of the top utilities of the world, even though it maybe not supplied everybody with power, but the ones that was designated to supply did very well. Now, if you come to where we are now as industrial users who are now islands of need, crying for power, it's a little bit more difficult. So you can't rely on Eskom. They're broken, and they're so corrupted and interfered with that I don't think they'll ever come right. And secondly, you need to get past a whole lot of hurdles because we are being strangled by the regulations in this country. You need to be able to say, well, come hell or high water, I'm going to get past these hurdles, and the ones that I can't get past and which I think I deem are unnecessary or illegal or illegitimate rather, I'm going to ignore them. I'm going to be bolshy, and I'll take my case to court if I need to be, but I will do what is necessary to meet my needs as an industry to supply jobs and to supply development and GDP for this economy. And I don't think any court is going to actually penalize you for taking that attitude, given the history, which is now very, very obvious to everybody as to what the situation is and how dreadful, how dire the situation is in South Africa. So you really need businessmen who've got the gumps to actually take control and say, I'm going to do whatever is necessary. Now, once you get there, then you do an options analysis and say, well, which of my missions are mission critical? And then you cut your cloth to suit that need. And typically for the mining industry, you will need either gas, but we don't have a gas infrastructure, we don't have supply, but it can be developed very quickly, or you need coal. And there's a big problem with fossil fuels and the farce of global warming. And I say that learnedly because I've done my research on that area. And then, or thirdly, nuclear. There are other smaller new technologies that are emerging, but they're not industrial grade yet. So at this stage, they're not going to solve today's problems. They maybe solve next generation's problems. But the answer lies in one of those. So somewhere along the line, you need to have space to be able to put up your own power plant, and you need to have the budget. And typically, if you're a corporate, and I come out of the corporate world, we've always taken energy as a buy-in. We've never said we'll put up our own plant. And putting up an energy plant can be quite expensive because you've got to go for quite big scale, and you've got to build in a lot of redundancy if you're now going to be the sole supplier of your own energy, because you, as I said, you've got mission critical stuff. So that will limit what your availability is. And of course, if you look along the paradigm, solar is mooted as your cheapest. It's in fact not. It's in fact the most expensive because everybody forgets to add in the cost of storage, which is 20 times more expensive than coal. But anyway, but you'll then do your investigations and try and do a hybrid solution. I think that's the only way to go forward, is to do a hybrid solution that will hopefully be economical, affordable, and will provide you with the level of redundancy and energy security that your business requires. And really, it will take a particular type of animal, somebody who's outspoken, somebody who's got thick skin, who can withstand the pressure from the politicians. I mean, I spoke to some people last week. They said they're quite happy to put in the energy, but when they approached the government and asked for permission, they were told they're going to have halve off at least 30% for BEE. Well, that's all nonsense, because halving off stuff for departments or divisions of society that don't add anything to the equation is an absolute waste. I can't think of a bigger waste than spending money on utilities that add no value to your solution that you're trying to develop. So yes, and for the government and the ANC to want to grab a free ride out of every project coming their way in the mining and energy complex is besides unethical, is totally ridiculous. And I think any wise businessman will do the right thing and ignore it and send them packing to where they belong. And that is the only way. If you don't have that sort of guts, if you don't have the frontier attitude where I'm going to take control of the situation, and anything that comes in my way, I will bulldoze out of the way. And I'll make sure I deliver to my constituency, my stakeholders, the right solution at the right price. And that's it. I'm not taking no for an answer. That's the mentality, the winner's mentality that will get us through this. Anything more timid or less robust, I'm afraid you can close down this economy and we will all sit and watch the sunset.
Yeah, Ted, I think that's a very good point that you make around asking for forgiveness rather than permission, because when you ask for the permission, that's when all those corrupt regulatory hurdles start being imposed. I think it's a very good example.
I'm the first one to apologize. If I've irritated something or transgressed, I'm sorry. But I've got a job to do, and I'll do it as best I can, and to hell with the rest. You know, you've got to be focused. If you're not focused on this thing, and if you want to take in, if you want to run opinion polls on everything, I mean, there are enough people, I don't know, who seem to have the mission to stop any development, whether it's the green lobby or the fossil fuel lobby or whoever it is. There are enough detractors. I don't know. It seems to me there are more people making money out of detraction than there are people actually doing the work nowadays. You can't have that attitude. You've got to be really focused, and you've got to be strong in this economy and this world with the globalists running around and trying to dictate what you're allowed to do and not to do. You've got to have a very strong constitution.
All right. So Ted, you mentioned renewable energy, and I think you highlighted this problem, lack of baseload capacity. And, you know, I think there is this global lobby to so-called adopt renewables. And, you know, certainly if there was a more liberalized energy generation framework in South Africa, if the market could determine through supply and demand and through price signals that are not interfered with, that renewables is a fair component of the energy mix, would you support that, or are you dismissing renewables out of hand?
No. Look, for whatever, if it's fit for the purpose that the people that want to deploy it, I mean, I've got no qualms. I'm not here to dictate to anybody what type of energy generation methodology they need to follow. But I just need to caution that people need to understand that renewable salesmen are like second-hand car salesmen. They're interested in selling. They're not interested in your problems after the fact, and whether it's delivery or non-delivery, or whether the cost of surprised you or run out of kilter. they couldn't care what you do afterwards. They just want to do the sale. It's like the old IBM salesmen of 60 years ago. They sold you the biggest possible machine with the most commission for them possible. Your later problems of trying to make the thing work and see whether it's surplus or superfluous or whatever, that's not they're not interested in that. They'll sell you 1 billion gigawatts if you've got the checkbook. Whether you know what to do with it, that's not their problem. And that's how ruthless the market is, unfortunately. And you've got all these people thinking that renewable people care about the world and they care about the environment. Well, the fact of the matter is the residue of the renewable sector, the blades and the rare earths and the heavy minerals are so toxic. They are far more toxic than any carbon emissions that you will ever get on this earth. So, people like to see what they want to see and they like to ignore what they want to ignore. But the bottom line is people must choose what they want to do as long as they comply with some sort of environmental, and the environmental regulations need to be reasonably equitable. I mean, you can't ignore the renewables and the damage that they do, and the child mining in the DRC for coltan and all those rare earth products. You can't want to lambaste the coal industry for a little bit of fossil fuel emissions, but you ignore the dangers of heavy metals getting into your water system, because the windmills are getting buried under the ground because there's no use for recycled blades, etc., etc. So yes, I think as long as it's equitable, it's fine. But at the end of the day, people must decide. It's like the mining along the east coast of the country. I mean, there's been lots of political fights about the mining. The bottom line is the greenies say, well, that's prime eco-tourist territory. I come from the Eastern Cape. I'm a Xhosa. And I can promise you that they've been talking about ecotourism in that part of the world for the whole of my 63 years that I'm alive. And nothing has happened because either we rob the tourists or we murder them or we rape them, but nobody's put a penny into proper eco-tourist development in the East Coast for over 60 years. So it's fine for all these people to brag about, you're damaging this and you're damaging that. The fact of the matter is mining is a wasteful exercise, and the energy generation is an industrial activity. But the way Eskom does it, I think that's where people make a big mistake. They think that, yes, we need to be careful and enduring of Eskom's bad management. As much as they are corrupted in the way that they procure things and spend money and steal, so they are also wasteful in the way that they generate power and pollute the world. I can take you to power stations around the world where you'll be a meter away and you will not see any visible emissions. You don't have to have any visible emissions. And the little bit of carbon that does go up is anyway, it's less than 0.0001% of the greenhouse gases that so-called the warming in there. 96% of the greenhouse gases is water vapor. If you want to stop the greenhouse gases warming the earth, then you need to put blankets on the oceans. And anyway, the environment has changed 1 billion times over the last 1 billion years. You and I, whatever we do, you're not going to stop the climate change. Climate change is part and parcel of the universe. So I don't buy that argument. In terms of running the place efficiently and cleanly, yes, Eskom complains about its old fleet. The fleet that is being reopened up now because of the Russian gas crisis in Europe, those plants in Germany and in Belgium and in Poland are all older than Eskom's fleet, all of them, and they're running perfectly. They are in good nick, they've got good engineers, they fixed them up nicely, and they're running well, and they were in such good nick that they could just chuck some coal in and restart them within a week. So it can be done. Not because Eskom is failing us doesn't mean the energy industry is failing us. We need to find and design a way around the hurdles and take control of our destiny. If we don't take control of our destiny, nobody else is going to do it for us.
So Ted, much has been made about the announcement last year to lift the cap on private energy generation up to 100 megawatts. But we're not really seeing much movement there. Why is that taking so slow? And I mean, to me, when I look at that, I think that was a reform that was sort of imposed on the government. It was like a reactive reflex rather than something that the government was actively embracing.
Okay, you'll recall that prior to the 100 megawatt cap, the cap was 1 megawatt, and then there was talk about 10 megawatts. The fact of the matter is 99.9% of businesses don't employ an electrical engineer. We didn't need to. Eskom did it all for us. So by suddenly introducing a liberation or opening up of the licensing requirements, you caught everybody off guard. And I guess the first thing you need to do, I mean, if you're a reasonable manager, not a fool, is to go and get the expertise. Now, because 99% of the expertise on energy was located within Eskom and the municipalities, there's a dearth. And even of that expertise has been dumped by Eskom over the last 27 years because of BEE. Most of those people have either retired or they've immigrated. So yes, you've suddenly got a new domain that's opened up and no expertise. Then on top of that, you haven't got budgets. This stuff costs a lot of money. You're talking about capital expenditure of lots of big amounts of money. You know, the stuff comes in big chunks. These are lumpy investments. And together with the fact that there's a shortage of expertise, it will take a while. So it's not going to be instant porridge where you just add water and the solution is going to appear out of thin air. It will take quite a while for the industry to acquire the expertise, and then to make, you've got to make a very judicious decision. Am I going to try and embark in a new direction and introduce lots of new risk into my business because it's an industry that I'm not familiar with, and I'm going to have to gear up completely? I'm either going to do it properly or I'm going to close my business. And that's the decision. Other than the mining industry, which has to be where the minerals are, obviously, a lot of other industries have actually decided to pack up. I mean, it's not common knowledge, but we've lost more than 70 foundries in the last 14 years of load shedding. And we've lost more than 45 smelters of various sizes, including some of the biggest smelters that have been outsourced to Malaysia, where the energy is much, much cheaper and much more robust. So, and that's some senior members close to government and senior members of the ANC that have actually taken their own businesses offshore. But that's what happens with business. If the government policy isn't amenable to doing what you need to do, you close shop. That's it. You go and find something else to do. And that's what's happening in South Africa. That's why we've got 3 million plus people excess, unemployed, and new people not getting jobs. I mean, out of every matric year, I mean, less than 20% of the people are actually getting jobs.
All right. So, Ted, what about pricing of electricity? I mean, in terms of the tariffs, Eskom has to apply to NERSA, the regulator, for permission to hike rates. Would it not be better if we just had a floating price that might create in the short term a big spike in pricing, but it would eventually settle at a kind of more natural price equilibrium that would be more fair and would enable some of these private providers to compete more equitably?
No, absolutely. I'm a free marketeer. So, yes, I think all these price caps and things are actually artificial. And this whole argument of Eskom to want to be cost reflective is a joke. I mean, how can a monopoly be cost reflective? Because all its cost is the price. I mean, and the more inefficient it is, the higher the tariff. So, no, that's the old Brian Jarmus trick that he tried to pull on us. And it's been with Eskom in their narrative for the last 15 years. So I wouldn't fall for that joke. No, I'm all for open price. The fact is, NERSA has been hijacked as well for the last 14 years, in that they bought the nonsense of Eskom being starved of capital. Eskom was starved of capital because of the corruption, and they fell for the joke and they increased the tariff so that Eskom could fund its capex out of its current income. I mean, that's, if you follow accounting, that's totally anathema to running a business. So yes, I would say that you can have an open market. You've got a problem with the grid, and the problem with the grid is actually that the grid, as we know it, is actually a legacy issue. And going forward, and I think we need to spend 10 seconds on looking forward. I did this at a paper in Cape Town about 3-4 years ago. Going forward, I see that the way that consumers will need energy will be very, very different to what we consume at the moment. We will not in future be dependent on a grid. Our needs will be micronized. So your demand for energy will be in millivolts as opposed to kilovolts or megavolts. As your equipment becomes more efficient and your storage improves, etc., etc. So I think 99% of the households certainly the bricks and mortar households will go off the grid, and they will find adequate solutions from renewables for their own domestic or for cluster houses consumption. And then you'll be stuck with indigents who can't afford electricity, and mega industries, the energy intensive user group, who are large consumers of energy and don't have enough property to actually put up their own generating facilities because they need large facilities. They will be stuck as users of the grid power, so to speak. But you've seen it with the COVID. The railway lines have disappeared. As we speak on a daily basis, when there's load shedding, the grid is disappearing. It's getting stolen and sent off to the smelters in the Far East. So I don't see the grid, unless if you're going to put a watchman every 100 meters, I don't see the grid being around for the next forever. Maybe for another 10 years at the longest. And then we'll be without a grid. The energy needs will have been micronized and packaged into much smaller units, and we will be able to have on-site generation wherever you are. And that will be, so the grid will fall in disarray, like the telecom grid. I mean, Telkom's not putting up any copper wires anymore. Everything's wireless. You actually can do electricity transmission wireless as well. It just hasn't been perfected properly. But those things will certainly get legs as we move forward over the next 10 years. So, yeah, I can see that if we look forward and we see that people are going to actually take ownership of their own power generation and needs, then I think we face a very different landscape. And the only people where there will be a market are the mega users, and how that will settle out. I guess it will work best if you have an open market where they contract with each other on an arm's length basis. And you should then see the price of electricity or energy come down drastically, because if you do the costing on where Eskom is and where Eskom should have been, had there not been corruption and incompetence, the cost of electricity should be roughly a quarter of what you and I pay, not what we are invoiced for consumption, but what we pay at the end of each month. Because in your bill is your direct consumption plus all the extra overheads of Eskom or the municipality. So your bill is actually inflated by a factor of more than 3 times what it would have been if everything had been run efficiently. So I see that in the long term, the real cost of energy will come down drastically over the next couple of years. And yes, it will only happen if people say, to hell with the government, I'm taking control of this and I'll do whatever the best solution is for my needs.
Yeah, and I think the problem at the moment is that Eskom is a single point of failure. And so what you want to do is spread that risk out. So if entrepreneurs do fail, that happens all the time in free markets, well, it doesn't collapse the whole system. Yeah, and to your point about the grid, it does seem, even to me as a non-technical person, maybe a bit inefficient to be transporting energy all the way down from Mpumalanga to the rest of the country, except for maybe Cape Town, which has the Kuberg facility, which is what I want to speak to you about next, Ted, before we close this conversation, which is the future of nuclear. It has a bit of a bad name and is associated with the corrupt Zuma years. Well, when Zuma was pushing aggressively for nuclear, doesn't mean that the corruption has gone away per se. That was just his preferred vehicle for it. But what do you foresee nuclear power playing? What role do you foresee for it in the future?
Okay, I mean, I'm going to throw away a side comment. Zuma didn't invent the nuclear deal. It was actually generated before that. He wasn't part of the equation, and that's why he kiboshed the previous effort and then installed his own nuclear project. And I did the calculations at the time. I said, if it's more than 250 billion, it smells of corruption. 250 to 500 billion would be the maximum for 9 gigawatts of new nuclear power. When I heard the number of R1 trillion and more, I knew that there was something very, very wrong with it. Okay, so where we are today, it's actually quite amazing how things evolve over time. Not only do we just get older, but technology also gets better. So I don't think anybody in their right minds today would commission a new legacy nuclear project. What am I talking about? So Kuberg is generation 1 nuclear technology, together with Long Mile Island and all the old Fukushima and so on. And then you got generation 2 which is supposed to be Hinkley Point and so on. And then they currently have some new models in Korea of generation 3. And on the cards at the moment is generation 4 nuclear technology, of which the Russians we would have been the guinea pigs for generation 4 nuclear technology from the Soviet Union. And each time there's significant improvements in the new technology. However, the legacy of that technology is that it's vastly expensive, it's very time-consuming, and prone to lots of corruption and misdemeanors along the road. Notwithstanding, and not even to mention the regulatory hurdles, etc., and the fact that you needed a state guarantee in case of disaster, because that was part and parcel of that legacy technology. Where we are today is something where South Africa actually was a pioneer for a while under Eskom, and then again they messed it up. They spent about 40 billion rand and then closed the project. Is the pebble bed technology. We call it pebble bed, but the rest of the world calls it small modular nuclear reactors. And those are reactors anything between 20 megawatts and 200 megawatts. So what makes them very different? Or quite a few things. Firstly, they are low pressure vessels, so they can't explode. So that's your first risk gone. Secondly, they can run for 12 years on one set of fuel. Okay, and that's very different from coal or anything else that needs to guzzle fuel all the time. So you need to have a team come around every 12 years and refurbish the fuel, and the fuel is recyclable. Thirdly, they're air cooled. So you don't need to put them next to the coast where they can use copious amounts of water. The new stuff is air cooled, so you can put it down next to every village, every town. It's modular. If you need more than one unit, you can put a unit up now, and when you need more power, you put the next one up next door, and they are self-contained, basically. So it's got a lot of advantages. And on top of that, they are busy making them so they come off the shelf. So all you need to do, you need to put a foundation in the ground, and within 18 months to 2 years, you can have a nuclear plant generating power. You just need to do a small switch yard with the interconnect. But as for the rest, all the stuff that took years and years of regulatory fighting and arguing, all that has fallen by the wayside. You don't need that. And it's in that vein that I'm now urging people to go and put in orders for the small nuclear modular reactors. And yes, the legislation is a decade behind. That will have to catch up. But it's not my job as a businessman to catch up with governments and society. I need to solve a problem. So I think what we need to do is go ahead, solve the problem, and wait for government, or not wait for them. Hopefully one day they will catch up and wake up and smell the roses. But that's the way to go. So yes, in terms of all the ugly things about nuclear, about it being a high risk, about radioactive fallouts, etc., hopefully all those will be squashed by the new technology, and that people will feel reassured that this is actually true, and that they're not being sold a pup by the nuclear industry. Certainly I've done a bit of research, and I've got industry associates who are very, very intimately involved there, and they've all assured me that this stuff is already rocketing along, and both the Chinese have now connected their first two small modular reactors onto their grid. The second one, I think, happened at the end of last year, and it's running very, very well. And as far as I know, the Russians have done a number of smaller ones, and they haven't connected them to the grid. They've put them into villages that are desolate and are remote, and where there is no grid. They've now put them into those small villages, and those small villages have now got electricity, and they are now being compelled to pay taxes willingly to central government, which previously they didn't want to pay because they said they got no services from central government. I don't know if you know the landscape in the Urals. There's some very habitable places there where people are living, and they certainly need modular solutions because they're so remote from everybody else. So yes, I think that is the way, and we could lead again, not because we own the technology, but because we've got the need. We could get into the queue and get hold of those off-the-shelf solutions and start throwing the concrete slabs for the foundation. And within a year or two, certainly Cape Town, is making noises about going along that. Well, though they're still dancing with renewables, which I had occasion to tell them last week they'd be loony if they tried to base the Cape Town economy on weather-based energy generation. But anyway, I think that's something that they will now wake up and have a serious look at. And I think it's so imminent that before you can say abracadabra, it will be a daily experience, getting nuclear power into your industry.
So Ted, just as a final word from you, how would you recommend that ordinary people watching this show can start to push for greater energy independence in their personal lives, but also for businesses that they may be a part of or local communities that they might be a member of?
Okay, so I think as with the advent of any new industry, you get every man and his dog is an expert, and every second man and his dog is there to rip you off and make a fast buck. Was an overnight operator. You're going to need to keep a savvy about you, and but certainly I think it's time to engage. And I think, unfortunately, like with any new development, the first part of the journey is education. People need to get themselves educated. They need to get some sort of skill set on board, do a survey and see if they need what their needs are exactly, because you can't start ordering and procuring if you don't have a definitive idea of what your needs are. And we're going to see that now. We're going to see that with the mining companies. A lot of them have jumped the gun and have gone for renewables because it's vogue, etc., etc. I don't know what they're going to do at nighttime when they want to try and mine at nighttime or smelt metal at nighttime. They'll soon have a very rude awakening. But I think that the first thing is to get yourself educated and maybe surrounded by honest and credible expertise. It's going to be a difficult path, and there are going to be a lot of lessons that are going to have to be learned along the way. But I do believe that with the right resolve and with the right willpower and determination, we can get through this crisis as well. But it's not going to happen by waiting for Eskom or for the government to put candy in your mouth and pat you on the back. That's not the way that the future is going to unfold. The future belongs to those who are bold and take control of the situation and deliver to the communities that we operate in. There is a responsibility on us to not shut our eyes and not to be swayed by nonsense from the politicians and to do the right thing. There's a real responsibility on us to do that.
Well, Ted Blom, the present is a little bit dark, but this conversation has led me to believe that the future is a lot brighter. So I wanted to thank you very much for joining me on the show.
Absolutely. I look forward to the future. I think you're right. It's going to be a very bright future.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also leave your thoughts on this episode down in the comments section. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do leave a review there and share it with your friends or family. My name is David Ansara. This is the Solutions Podcast. Until next time, take care.